Why did the entire establishment lose its mind over 2 seconds in a Trump retruth? It wasn't because of a racist meme. It was the fear that their 2026 election rigging plans are being exposed. Because just like in the last 2 presidential elections, the globalists are wargaming the 2026 midterms, and we just caught them admitting it. Now, if you listen to the left, that retruth was proof that Donald Trump is a racist. If you listen to parts of the MAGA sphere, it was just Trump trolling the Obamas. They're both missing the point. That post was about fraudulent elections, and the president himself said it.
If you take a look at that and see the whole thing, it was a small section at the very end, but that was about fraudulent elections, which we have a lot of them. We're going to get it stopped. And I liked the beginning, I thought, and just passed it on. And I guess probably nobody reviewed the end of it, because what I saw at the beginning was really, really strong. It was about fraudulent elections. And anytime I see that stuff, and when it's credible, you put it up. But somebody slipped and missed a very small part.
The reason the establishment went into overdrive wasn't the 2 seconds they played on loop. It's because the Trump administration is now moving on every front to plug the holes in our election system. From DNI Director Gabbard's role in Georgia, to the fight for the SAVE Act to make sure only citizens vote, to the president's idea that the federal government should run elections in 15 states. Because everything rides on the midterms. The globalists know that if they can't stop a MAGA victory in 2026, they won't be able to stop the American system from coming back. And that terrifies them more than anything else Donald Trump is doing. I'm Susan Kokinda. I've been fighting vote fraud since the Carter election in 1976, when I saw a federal judge rule that our evidence did prove massive vote fraud in New York, but Jimmy Carter still became president. So I know what the score is, and I know that securing the 2026 midterms for Donald Trump is being fought on a much bigger battlefield than most people understand. Here's what I'm going to cover today. First, I'm going to expose the empire's midterm election strategy to delegitimize Trump and his policies before a single vote is cast. Second, how that strategy was already being tested in places like Texas. And third, how the Trump administration's revival of the American system is the weapon that defeats it. So let's go back to that racist post. Because 99% of that retruth was about the 2020 election and how the vote count stopped on election night in key states, and how Donald Trump's lead was then reversed as Democratic votes materialized out of thin air. The media doesn't want you to see that part because the Trump administration is now moving on every mechanism that was used to do it, like the FBI raid on the Fulton County, Georgia Board of Elections with DNI Director Tulsi Gabbard's presence, and the possible smoking gun evidence from Venezuela, where the arrest of Maduro may have provided hard proof of foreign interference, and all of the other efforts to force the states to clean up their voter rolls. But what has really put the elites into high gear is the president's suggestion that the federal government should run elections in 15 states. That has set the empire's election propaganda machine into overdrive. Look at this headline in Mother Jones. Project 2026, Trump's plan to rig the next election. And Amnesty International has just released a video showing a dystopian America warning of human rights crisis under Trump as voting rights face 2026 midterm threats. Now, I want you to listen to Michael Waldman of the Brennan Center speaking in an interview with The Atlantic magazine. But before you do, let's remember what the Brennan Center did in 2024. It was at the heart of the tabletop wargaming exercises to plot how to deny Trump a re-election victory. And here they go again.
The difference now, of course, is for the first time, I think, in American history, the federal government and the Trump administration are actively waging an effort to undermine the 2026 elections.
Let that sink in. The Brennan Center is calling routine election security measures an unprecedented effort to undermine elections. Now, Waldman isn't alone in tipping off the globalist plans. Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer, often touted as a possible 2028 Democratic presidential candidate, kind of spilled the beans in a recent interview.
What do you assume the president's approach is? He's talked about redistricting, gerrymandering, but do you assume that the president will be doing more to interfere from your point of view with the results?
I think it would be a mistake to assume that they're not going to. So I don't know precisely what it is that they might come up with, but we've got smart, sophisticated, savvy people around the tabletop that we will continue to get prepared.
Around the tabletop. That's that word again. And then when the interviewer pressed her on the details, here's what she said.
There are important reasons that I'm not going into a whole lot more detail on that, Steve. I think, I'll just leave it at this. We've got some brilliant folks who are working on this, and we will be prepared.
Think about that. The governor of a key battleground state just told you there are some brilliant folks working around the tabletop to prepare for the 2026 elections. She used the exact language of the 2024 wargaming operations, and then she refused to get specific. I wonder why. Because the elites are really in a mortal terror. They see in President Trump's second term a full-on declaration of war against their globalist system and a revival of the American system. And all they can do now is to try and cut it off by running their war games and their psychological operations to deny the president a Congress that will work with him, and they would like to give him a Congress that will impeach him. Now, we just saw that strategy in action in Texas. On January 31st, a special election for a Texas state Senate seat turned into a warning shot. A district that Donald Trump carried by 17 points in 2024 saw the Republican candidate lose in what should have been an absolutely safe race. Now, let's go back to that interview with the Brennan Center's Mike Waldman, and look at when it was recorded. It was recorded back on December 10th. And here's what Walden said then about how Democrats could flip back voters who had voted for Trump in 2024.
And in Texas in particular, for example, what they aimed to do was move some more Democratic voters out of Democratic districts and in fact to try to flip some of the southern Texas districts that have been, to many people's surprise, moving toward the Republicans, even though they're heavily Hispanic. But that kind of assumed that the voting patterns in that community would stay the same as they were in 2024, when Donald Trump won a very substantial share of the Latino vote all over the country. The ICE raids, the brutality, and all these other things we've seen seem to be pushing that community back toward, in a sense, more traditional partisan landing spot in the Democratic Party.
Did you hear that? They were counting on the anti-ICE provocations. This is a month before things really escalated in Minnesota. They predicted that the violence and the media hysteria would push Latino voters away from Trump, and in Texas, it worked. And you can bet that people at the higher levels of the empire have no problem with people getting killed, and that's what happened in January. The Minneapolis shootings, the rioting, all of it fed the narrative that Trump is an authoritarian. And then the empires turned that narrative into votes in a Texas special election. That's how wargaming really works. It's not just about the operational side of stealing votes, as important as that is. It's about carrying out the kind of full-spectrum psychological warfare that traps people in the globalist narrative and manipulates them into voting against their own interests. So how do you defeat that? Well, you put people in the real world of economic growth that is being built by the Trump administration. And here's the irony. In that Texas race, the Democratic candidate talked about economics, jobs, and wages, while the Republican candidate pulled out the tired old Karl Rove Bush playbook on social issues. Think about that. The Democrat stole Trump's economic message while the Republican ran away from it. And it's even worse. Across the country, deep state Republicans are telling candidates to distance themselves from Donald Trump. Here's what a former chairman of the Michigan Republican Party said. Michigan GOP can sweep 2026, stick to issues, avoid Trump. Now that is a losing formula, and it's not an accident because it's designed to lose. But the winning formula already exists, and the Trump administration is laying it out every single day. The winning formula is the American system, and in the past few weeks, the Trump administration has put the globalists on notice. Your system is finished. Last week, Vice President J.D. Vance opened the critical minerals ministerial meeting in D.C. with a frontal attack on one of the key pillars of the British imperial system, their control of raw materials through cartels and their three trade policies.
We see telltale signs of a market distorted beyond recognition, one that punishes strategic investment, one that punishes diversification, and one that punishes long-term planning. This is crazy. We should have the kind of global markets, the kind of domestic markets that reward long-term planning, that reward strategic thinking, and that's exactly what we're trying to do. I think every single one of us represented in this room has become dependent on arrangements we did not choose, and right now, arrangements that we cannot control. We all face the same vulnerability: access to the things that protect our people and sustain our way of life. Everything from missile defense systems to energy infrastructure to advanced manufacturing to emerging technologies. The fundamental supply chains that support these industries sometimes can vanish in the blink of an eye without any control or influence from many of the countries in this room. And we in the Trump administration believe it is the business of the government, of the people's government elected just over a year ago, to confront such problems.
Did you catch that? He said that giving up the ability to develop your own critical minerals is crazy. And it is. Losing control over vital sections of your economy, like minerals and rare earths or food, is a hallmark of imperialism. It gives the globalists enormous power to economically blackmail nations. Now, this administration initiative on strategic minerals, called Project Vault, isn't just for the United States. It's open to participation by other countries. And believe me, the empire doesn't like that. This blow for economic sovereignty follows on the administration's Davos offensive, where the Trump team declared globalization dead. And that came right on the heels of an earlier interview by U.S. Trade Ambassador Jameson Greer. He did a no-holds-barred takedown of the British free trade dogma in an interview with The Economist.
Here's World Trade Organization agreements, here's NAFTA, here are these other trade agreements, and they're set in stone, and they will never change, even if it leads to offshoring of America, even if it means manufacturing lossing, even if it means that China becomes the biggest manufacturer in the United States. It's a suicide pact and we have to stick to it. That's crazy, right? That is a recipe for losing your sovereignty and your economic vitality, and we can't have that.
Think about that. The U.S. trade representative just called the last 30 years of trade policy a suicide pact. And he did it in an interview with The Economist, which is the editorial flagship of the City of London. Now, here's the historical context that almost no one is giving you. The policies being talked about by Greer and Vance are an open revival of the American system. The British Empire that thought they had finished off these policies over 100 years ago with the assassination of William McKinley in 1901. President McKinley was the last aggressive user of tariffs, the last proponent of the American system of Hamilton and Lincoln. And after McKinley, we got the Federal Reserve, imperial wars, and the Anglo-American special relationship. That's what's so extraordinary about this moment. The administration's full-on embrace of American system principles actually defines what it means to make America sovereign again. And it is the message that wins elections, because it will change people's lives. So let's step back and see what's really happening. The globalists are already running their tabletop war games to rig the 2026 midterms. They're pre-positioning the threat to democracy narrative to delegitimize any Trump victory. And they're testing their psychological operations in places like Texas and Minneapolis. But here's what they can't stop. They can't stop the factories being built, or the mortgage rates coming down, or the tariffs that are reshoring American industry and bringing jobs back. The American system is winning, and that's why they're desperate. Our job, and I mean all of us, is to make sure that the midterm campaigns are fought on this ground, the ground of economic growth and sovereignty, not on the ground the empire has prepared for us.
Yes, we know the cornerstone is Christ alone, our hope now forever.